In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, as we hurtle on in this second full year of lockdown and similar restrictions, the minds of many of us at the moment are occupied maybe with the question of a holiday, or as they say, perhaps more in America than in the UK, a vacation. You know, will I need a PCR test when I come back, and so on and so forth. I mention this as a sort of segue really, just because the English word vacation is of course derived from the Latin word vacare, which is the subject of today's reflection. It's the title, Vacare Deo. So as we start to think then about holidays in this modern, ordinary, human, everyday sense of the word, perhaps it would be a good time to think about this notion of vacare, and perhaps particularly Vacare Deo, and what it's come to mean in the spiritual life and the monastic life in particular. Maybe the first thing to think about then, oddly enough, is, what does this word, this term, Vacare Deo, mean? Well, oddly, the word vacare in Latin, it's a verb, in a strange way, it's quite a neutral sort of word. It can mean to be empty, to be vacant, to be void of something, to be lacking something, not to contain something. And maybe so far that's not particularly appealing. But many of the ancient authors, and particularly when we get into the Christian period, the period of the church, many of the authors go beyond this literal sense to give it an added meaning. Not just to be empty, but to be free from, for instance, labour, work, to be unbusied, to have leisure or to have time for something, to be free to attend to something, to be free to devote oneself to something. And it's really, oddly enough, in this last sense, or the very rich sense, I would say, that the term has become important in the Christian spiritual tradition, beginning, I think, probably with St. Augustine, and under his influence, continuing into the medieval monks and nuns, maybe particularly the Cistercians. And oddly enough, the something is not that we're free for, that we're free to attend to, that we're free to devote ourselves to, is not a thing at all, in fact, but a someone, Deo, God. Being free for God. Vacare Deo as a term then in the medieval spiritual literature is linked with another term, Otium sanctum, which sometimes gets translated as holy leisure. Leisure is a term that in our modern sense can seem a bit sort of pejorative. We sometimes call somebody a lady of leisure or a gentleman of leisure, meaning that really they're somebody that doesn't do very much in life, and we sort of look down on them. But are we losing maybe a positive sense of what leisure is, and particularly otium sanctum, holy leisure? Again, otium in Latin means a leisure, a being free for something, an idleness in a positive sense. And interestingly, the opposite of otium is negotium, non-otium, non-leisure. And that is everything which is to do with business and activity and occupation and having things to do and so on. So it's quite interesting that in that sort of Latin psychology, the negative thing is the busyness, the activity, the being taken up with things. And the non-negative thing, the positive thing, if you like, is the being free for things, the leisure. Why then is this so important in the spiritual life? Well, I think largely because the spiritual life, as we so often forget, is a relationship. And like any relationship, the spiritual life is a relationship which needs time. So much in the spiritual life, as in every other relationship that we have, if we think about it, so much is about letting things flow, letting things happen. Well, oddly enough, things need time and space in which to happen. God in our lives needs time and space in which he can work, time and space in which we can be with him. And that's what this leisure time is. When we think of being at leisure, we think of holidays, we think of time off, perhaps we just think about being free and we stop there. Or if we are being slightly more sophisticated about it, we think about being free from. And we had that in the definitions, didn't we? Leisure as being free from labour. And it's in that sense that some of the spiritual writers, including St. Benedict, view it slightly dimly, with suspicion. St. Benedict in chapter 48, for instance, says that people should be given work to do if they won't do their Lectio Divina, lest they should be idle. Ut non vacet. So they should not be just at leisure for nothing. So not just free, not even just free from things, but the question is being free for something. In that same chapter, chapter 48, St. Benedict speaks in a very positive way about how the brethren should be free for reading, spiritual reading, Lectio Divina, free for God in other ways. It's interesting, again, this word vacare, vacate, similarly, are so important in the spiritual tradition. One of the Psalms says, vacate et videte quoniam ego sum Deus, which we normally translate into English as, be still and know that I am God. But it literally means, be at leisure. Have the freedom to be devoted to me as God, and you will see that I am God. So there's this sense that if we want to perceive the action of God in our lives, we have to give him the space. We have to give him the time. We have to make time for this holy leisure. Why does leisure get such a bad press? Well, I think sometimes because it can be seen as escapism. An escapism into a sort of mindlessness, just a nothingness. But this is not true of real leisure, of holy leisure. St. Bernard talks about Otium as Otium negotiosissimum, which is a very strange sort of term, and it means a very busy lack of busyness. Or if we wanted to sort of translate it in a slightly different way, it would be an absorbing leisure. A leisure which is not just a nothingness, it's something which draws us in. Like much in our lives that's worthwhile, this sort of holy leisure can be quite demanding. And if we're honest, maybe that's why that sort of leisure is so rare in our lives. We'll perhaps have a litany of excuses as to why we have such leisure time, such a lack of free time in our lives. We complain perhaps often about how little time we have for prayer or for Lectio Divina or for all these other things. Maybe we have to get actually beneath that litany of excuses. Sometimes maybe it would do us good to really look at why it is that we have such little time for leisure. And I think one prevalent reason is because the sort of leisure which involves spending time with God can ask a lot of us, can be demanding. If there is such a lack then of true otium, true leisure, true freedom to be available to God in our lives, why is that? What are maybe some of the enemies of this very good thing for us? Well, the first thing would be perhaps laziness. We do want to be free, but not free for anything in particular, just to flop, to do nothing. Now, I wouldn't want to suggest for a minute that we don't sometimes need time when we just need to stop and let our body and our spirits, for that matter, just catch up and take a breath. Of course we do. But is that really the totality of what we want to do with our free time? Well, I hope not. We've said already how St. Benedict thinks that being free for no particular purpose is a bad thing. And it's quite interesting that if we think of the gospel and Jesus' story of the house which is swept out and kept tidy and all the rest of it, and then it says the demon that's been swept out comes back and finds it empty, we say in English. But the Latin word, strangely used in the Vulgate translation of the Gospels, is vacantem. Again, free, unoccupied, but for no particular purpose. That sort of freedom is not going to lead us to a positive reality. So if that sort of laziness, if you like, is going to be an enemy of true leisure. Perhaps more significantly, particularly in our Western world, I would say, there is the enemy of leisure, which is workaholism. Josef Pieper, the German philosopher, in his essay, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, I mean, we might translate it more liberally as leisure, the basis of life, really, talks about total work. And I wonder whether that's how we view ourselves. Are we like the Latins? Do we regard work, the occupied parts of our life, as the negative thing, and leisure, the being free for a relationship, as the positive thing? Or, in common with much of our Western world, do we actually live to work rather than work to live? We think about, the biological species we belong to as Homo sapiens. Do we really think we belong to Homo laborans, the human being that's there to work? And if so, why is that? Do we work because it fills up our space with something which is very predictable, rather than making space in our lives for God, who after all can, as Gerard Hughes reminds us, be the God of surprises, the God who can ask things which, yes, may be fruitful for us and may lead us to a more fulfilled life, but which nonetheless are disconcerting because he is and they are so unpredictable. Perhaps the third thing to speak about before we move towards letting you do some pausing and reflecting is lack of silence. And not just silence as noise, sound, or the opposite, but really a sense of, is there too much stimulation in our lives? Are we always looking for some sort of input from outside, but input which is perhaps not of the most significant type? So for instance, we all know how beneficial the internet can be. You're watching this on the internet. So many people have joined the monks at prayer in the choir in the Abbey Church, not physically due to the restrictions, but via the internet. How many interesting and uplifting spiritual texts and so on are there on the internet? But also, how easy is it for us to fritter away time and our lives on the internet, just looking for some sort of stimulation, something to fill a void that we perceive. A void that, as we've said, perhaps could be filled by God. So often we crave rest. And again, as we've said, while a physical stopping and just allowing ourselves to recoup can be necessary, it's not really the stuff of a whole life, is it? What's our real craving for? I would suggest it's not really for rest in terms of the stopping, but rest in terms of refreshment. What will refresh us? St. Augustine tells us that what will really give rest to our hearts is God. Maybe the question then for us as we embark on this day of retreat is, how will we make space for God to appear and act in our lives? How will we make time in our lives for us to have that contact with God, which is where we'll find our real refreshment? In the suggested activities for this day, I've given you various texts to use in your reflections on this theme of leisure and space. The first is a passage from a sermon by St. Aelred, and it's a sermon which oddly was for the Assumption, but which comments on the gospel story of Martha and Mary, and this issue of balance and freedom for the good things of life, for lectio, for prayer, for converse with God. Maybe read that passage. It's a passage which I think shows how difficult monks find it at times to give the right amount of space to God and to the search for God in our lives. So perhaps read that text and ask, what does it have to teach you about the need for balance and the need for Otium, for a real sort of leisure in your life? What might it be asking you to look at the moment in your life, and areas in which perhaps the balance is not what it should be? In a related sense then, maybe spend some time thinking about the last several weeks, months if you like, of your life, and just identify where was the space for holy leisure, space just to stop and be with God. Perhaps to be with the others with whom you have a relationship in your life. And if the answer is, well, actually there weren't very many of them, perhaps to ask, what is it that's stopping you from making time for this very necessary sort of breathing space in life? And then thirdly, in that chapter 48 of the rule, which I mentioned in the talk, St. Benedict talks about us being free, being at leisure for reading, for lectio, literally, in the Latin. So I've given you 4 very short passages from the Gospels, 3 from St. Mark and 1 from St. Luke, which in this happens to be the story of Mary and Martha. And they're all passages which relate to Jesus somehow being at leisure. And as so often is the case, perhaps we need to reflect on how if something's good enough for Jesus, it ought to be good enough for us. And what might Jesus' way of being in the Gospels have to teach us, have to teach you about how we ought to order and live our lives. So they're just 4 Gospel passages which you might choose, one of which you might choose rather, to do a bit of lectio in the course of the day. If you wanted to be free to join us in the Abbey Church for prayers, there is the midday office at 1 o'clock, there is Vespers at 6 o'clock, and there's complement at 9 o'clock. So it just remains for me to wish you a pleasant day of leisure and rest with the Lord.